You give somebody insulin, and I don't really care how much willpower you have, you gain weight. Why? Because you're literally telling your
Yeah.
body to gain that weight. So therefore, if that's the important thing, then how are you going to minimize those instructions to gain weight? Well, you eat natural foods, because natural foods, even carbohydrate containing foods, natural ones have far less insulin effect than others.
Yeah.
And intermittent fasting, when you don't eat, your body is your insulin levels are going to go low. Your body is going to start using calories instead of storing calories,
Yeah.
right? So it's all about those hormonal effects that we have to understand, that we said were unimportant because we sort of elevated calories to be the one and only thing. And I think a lot of fitness people and a lot of scientists, in fact, love the sort of simplicity of that idea. But unfortunately, it wasn't really true. And you see it
Yeah.
all the time. Like, there's so many people, like doctors, for example. There are a lot of doctors who are overweight. And I know a lot of doctors. Most of my friends are doctors, right? And would I say that they have no willpower? Absolutely not. I've seen these people work sort of 36 hours at a time, right? When they put their mind to something, they will absolutely go out and do it. Nothing will stop them. And yet these people are overweight. Some of them are obese. Some of them are my friends. I don't think they have no willpower.
Yeah.
I don't think they have a lack of willpower as the reason that they are overweight. I think they're eating the wrong foods because or they're getting the wrong advice to eat constantly and so on. And so many doctors have come back to me. So when I started talking about intermittent fasting, probably about 8 years ago, like, honestly, people thought I was insane. Like, it was, common knowledge that you had to eat all the time, even to lose weight, right? And when I came out and said, well, you can fast, I mean, and most of the doctors that I spoke to, because they knew me and they would listen to me, they said, this actually makes a lot of sense. And they were all like, I remember when I was in residency and training, I'd go like 24 hours without eating. Nothing bad ever happened.
Yeah.
I was so busy in the emergency. I was so busy in the operating room. I had so many patients. I just didn't eat, and nothing really happened other than I was hungry for a little while, but I was too busy. I ignored it. And I'm thinking, yeah, because when you don't eat, your body is just going to take whatever calories it needs from your body fat, and that's it. And everybody's like, yeah, I was like 30 pounds lighter at that time, right? When I didn't eat constantly.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of physicians would always come back and say, you know what, this makes a lot of sense from a physiologic standpoint. This idea that you should eat all the time is wrong. So one, fasting is a way to eat fewer calories because you're taking it from your stores, and you're feeling full because you've taken it from your stores, right? Just like you take food from the fridge, it doesn't mean you're less full. You're just as full as if you went to the store. Just you took those calories from a different place. You took it from storage. Same thing with body fat. You took those calories from storage as opposed to from food.
Yeah.
No difference in terms of physiology. So yeah, it's interesting because a lot of doctors themselves, even these sort of highly, highly educated people, would say it. And that's one of the things that I think has started to sort of resonate through. There's an interesting study where they did a Facebook poll of physicians and how they lose weight. And what was interesting was that 75% of people used intermittent fasting in this poll for weight loss, physicians. Yet they only counseled it for about 30%. So the huge gap was that the doctors wanted to lose weight and wanted to do something effective, which was fasting. But with their patients, they had to give sort of sanctioned advice, which didn't include the fast.
I want to get into some practical information for people. I think one of the really beautiful things you said so far is that it's not a lack of willpower. And unfortunately, this over focus on the calorie has led to a lot of people feel really bad, so that they think, I'm really trying. Like I'm restricting my calorie intake. I'm not eating that much, but I can't lose weight. And they feel like failures. They feel guilt. They feel ashamed of themselves, which is really, really toxic to try and make long-term behavior change when you feel like that. So I want to go into some really practical things. Before we do, just to finish off the calories in, calories out model for a moment, my approach has always been with patients, and when I, like you, when I write books, I say, look, if you find that counting calories works for you and you can fit it into your life and your lifestyle and you're getting the health outcome you desire, I'm not trying to change your mind. I'm not saying stop doing it. If that works for you, go for your life. I'm just saying, in my experience, I haven't found it to be that helpful, certainly for most people that come to see me. What would you say to someone who is watching this and says, Jason, listen, I actually have no problem counting calories. I like counting them 3 times a day, and I can maintain my weight, I can maintain my health doing this. What would you say to that person?
I agree with you. I mean, if something's working for you, then go ahead and do it. Like, there's no reason to stop. And it really goes for anything. It's if you're eating 10 times a day and you're doing well with it, then go ahead. Like, be my guest. And we know everybody reacts differently, so I'm okay with that. But if you want to make a change, then you could probably that's where to start, right? Here's a good place to start, and then you decide what to do with it. And I think the other thing, I think you said that was very good, was that this idea of sort of people who aren't losing weight. What happens, of course, is that when you focus on calories and say it's all about willpower, what you're saying to these people is that they don't have the willpower, which I think is absolutely not true, because it's one of these embedded assumptions in the calories in, calories out model that nobody acknowledges, which is that calories out can go down. Your basal metabolic rate can go down when you diet. So therefore, if you are not losing weight, even as you eat fewer calories, you could still not lose weight because your metabolic rate is going down along with it. So why are you blaming these people? And that's where you get a lot of a lot of people sort of just have made that assumption that calories out is going to stay stable at 2,000 calories a day, right? This is the whole thing. When you read these people who are like, oh, just cut 500 calories a day, you'll lose a pound a week. That actually never happens, because that assumes that your calories out, your metabolic rate stays at 2,000 calories. Every physiologic study we've ever done says it goes down. And it must go down. So for example, if you take somebody who's 200 pounds, you say cut 500 calories a day, you'll lose a pound a week. Does that mean in 200 weeks they'll weigh 0 pounds? Like, no, absolutely not. That will never happen, even if you stick to 1,500 calories. So therefore, your metabolic rate must go down at some point. Turns out it goes down almost immediately and persists. So therefore, this idea that it was all because they skipped on their diet, right? That's not true. It might have just been a very poorly constructed diet. That is not taking into account just the foods, but also the sort of eating duration, the fasting, the hormones, what hormones you're stimulating with the foods that you're eating, what information you're giving your body, what instructions you're giving your body. There's so much of that other things that are important. And I think it's time to take that sort of guilt and shame away from those people. We're all sort of working together.
Yeah, it's a great point. Let's get to the sort of practicalities. You've mentioned in your books, you mentioned in this conversation that chronically elevated insulin is problematic for a whole variety of different reasons. Yes, for the development of type 2 diabetes, of putting on weight. Also, a lot of people aren't aware that it increases blood pressure, increases fluid retention, increases a type of cholesterol called VLDL, very low density lipoprotein, which can be problematic. And so for a variety of reasons, we want to lower that. So there's 2 broad ways I'm getting that we can do that. One is through a diet that does not constantly push up insulin. And the other way is with a form of intermittent fasting. or bringing in some type. So if we start off with food and diet, you mentioned low carb earlier on in this conversation. Of course, we know how divisive the diet landscape currently is. In your experience, if we're thinking about a diet, food choices that don't spike insulin too much, what are the kind of principles you like your patients to follow?
Yeah, and I think this is where there's always a lot of difference in opinion versus low carb versus high carb. And I actually think that there's a huge difference even within carbohydrates. So the problem is not generally the carbohydrates, but the processing that makes the biggest difference. So if you look at the glycemic index, which is, which looks at carbohydrate containing foods, sees how much insulin tends to go up and glucose tends to go up. They tend to go up together of certain foods. What you see is that unprocessed carbohydrates tend to cause a lot lower spike in insulin than processed foods. So you take cereals like Cheerios and stuff, they're really, really high. You take a very refined product like white bread, just very, very high. But then you look at something like boiled potatoes, and it's just extremely low. They're both carbohydrate-containing foods. So there's a big difference even within carbohydrates. Beans are carbohydrates. They have a different type of amylopectin. They have amylopectin C versus amylopectin A. Their digestion is completely different. They're still carbs. So trying to simplify it to just carbs is difficult because you could eat a lot of beans, and who gets fat eating beans? Like very few people.
Are you talking like black beans, kidney beans, these sort of
yeah,
things?
All beans. Yeah. The type of carbohydrate they contain is amylopectin C, which is harder to digest and therefore leads to much lower blood glucose levels, much lower insulin levels. But insulin is sort of that key. So even within carbohydrates, so people think, well, one of the things is to cut carbs, which is a reasonable thing, but cutting the refined carbs does a lot better because you have to understand that a lot of countries, a lot of cultures have had high carbohydrate intakes and in the past have never had a big problem. So China, for example, was classic in the 80s. It was eating 300 grams a day of carbohydrates, almost all white rice. And there was almost no obesity. This is 1980. Then, of course, recently they started eating a lot more processed foods, a lot more sugary foods. Now their obesity is just exploding. But it was not just the carbs.
Why do you? This is really interesting for me. So, white rice is a refined carbohydrate. Why do we have societies with high volumes of carbohydrates who are not putting on weight and who are not getting type 2 diabetes? And that example you use of China there is really interesting. 300 grams of white rice a day, you would think would spike insulin and would, cause people to get sick, but it wasn't.
Yeah, and it wasn't.
And one of the theories I put forward in my first book was this idea that maybe in the West, in the modern world in which we now live, where people are chronically stressed, they're chronically underslept, they're chronically underactive, and they're eating a lot of highly processed foods. Altogether, that's creating the perfect conditions for high levels of insulin resistance. And I thought, well, maybe the low-carb diet has a particular utility in modern stressed-out cultures. I don't know. Have you got any comments on that? And how do you explain that in the 1970s, they were eating this in China and not getting sick?
I think there's a few things. One is that the amount of sugar they were eating was just almost zero.
Yeah.
So sugar, which is fructose, is metabolized quite differently than glucose. So when you metabolize glucose, all your cells in the body can use glucose. When you metabolize fructose, only the liver can use fructose. So the fructose goes straight to your liver, and there it gets converted and causes fatty liver, causes all kinds of things when you're eating too much fructose. So it can get converted back into glucose, but for a lot of reasons, it just gets turned into fat through de novo lipogenesis. You get fatty liver, you get insulin resistance, which causes hyperinsulinemia. So the fructose is actually much worse for you than the glucose, in my opinion, because if you are 150 pounds, you have 150 pounds of body that's using glucose versus sort of 5 pounds of liver that can metabolize fructose. So the fructose is much, much more obesogenic, I think, than the glucose. So therefore, the practical side is that sugar and sweet things like that are just much more fattening than starchy foods.
So maybe you're saying then in China, back then, because they're not having much fructose,
yeah, almost zero.
that therefore they can actually, the bodies can handle the 300 grams of white rice each day. Whereas on the background of a lot of fructose, which is of course how many of us live these days, too much sugar, too much fruit juice, all these kind of things, maybe with a background of that, suddenly the white rice starts to become problematic?
Yeah, I think so. I think the fructose really makes that much worse.
If you enjoyed that clip from my podcast, here's another powerful clip that is really going to help you with your health and happiness.
In the short term, it can lead to allergy and autoimmunity, but long term, it looks as if it increases the risk of a whole diverse range of very serious chronic diseases.